Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the September 22nd Ordinance Committee meeting. Madam Clerk, can we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Jordan.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Here.
Chair Gutierrez.
Present. All right. Let the minutes reflect that we're all present. Ms. Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
There are not.
Okay. Do we have any public comment for items that aren't on the agenda?
At this time, we do not.
Okay. Ms. Clerk, may you please read the first agenda item or our only agenda item?
Subject, amending the city's grading ordinance addressing grading less than 50 cubic yards on hillside properties. Recommendation that ordinance committee directs staff to send the attached grading ordinance amendments to city council for introduction, public hearing, and consideration for adoption.
Thank you. Now, if we may have the staff report, Mr. Stuffler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair Gutierrez. I'm Andrew Stuffler, the building official for the city. And I'm sorry with my bifocals if I have to tilt my head up and down, but I'm trying to read as we go here. So thank you for having us back. We were before you on July 21st, talking about grading ordinance amendments. And we received some direction from the committee to include a self-certification program and that we build in some provisions so that the city can ask for a licensed surveyor to do a survey and give us some more accurate grading quantity confirmation if we have question or doubt about the amount of grading that's occurred on a parcel. And that we only apply the self-certification program to parcels that are in the Hillside property definition, and we included that as an attachment to our staff report. We also, last week, we sent out some stakeholder outreach just to help our stakeholders in the list, the stakeholder list that's an attachment to the report, to help them understand that we're going to be going to Ordinance Committee today and to City Council possibly in the future, and to give them those dates so they could be prepared for that and aware and participate if they'd like. The ordinance amendments that we're bringing back to you, we have worked on with the City Attorney's Office, and they do require a self-certification of grading to be filled out, a form to be filled out and sent to our office and put in the street file for the public to view if they'd like. And that would be for hillside properties that are conducting grading in excess of 10 yards and less than 50 cubic yards. We'll be checking 20% of those self-certifications. We'll utilize our code enforcement program when we do receive complaints. And then if we don't have 20% there, we will go out and check the remaining self-certifications that they'll be randomly selected until we get to the 20% confirmation and verification. We also included in the ordinance a declaration under penalty of perjury so that it's very clear to permit applicants or those who think they don't need a permit, the penalties and liabilities they might incur if they file a false application or don't follow the requirements in the amended ordinance. And it explicitly provides, the ordinance explicitly provides for that any falsification or misrepresentation is a violation of the ordinance, and then it establishes some pretty clear fines and liabilities that the city could pursue. So with that, I'll take you through our presentation here. Next slide, please. So what is grading? We'll go over this again. We went over it before, but for the members of the public that might be joining us for the first time, grading is moving earth, either adding it or taking it away from a property or relocating it on the same property. We typically call that excavation or fill, excavation to remove and fill to add. We're considering these ordinance updates because we've had some hillside properties that have conducted grading that has caused concern for their neighbors, and we want to make sure that we're building in safeguards for the community to assure that grading that's done in the hillside areas is done in a manner that's not going to be detrimental to others. Let's see, explain the pros. Okay, and we can go. I talked about the grading self-certification program applying just hillside areas. Let's go to the next slide. So we're not going to be talking about grading that's associated with public roadways or excavations for buildings and foundations. And that latter category can be kind of counterintuitive. If you're a neighbor and you're watching these large quantities of earth being removed for a structure that's going to be built, technically that is not considered grading. That's considered excavation for a building foundation, and it is specifically exempt from our ordinance, grading ordinance, as well as the model that we used, which was a Los Angeles County ordinance. And I believe the same stands for Santa Barbara County as well. It's a common practice not to include that in the grading amount. Next slide. So obviously we're looking into these, into some additional safeguards for hillside properties because we want to mitigate or reduce the possibility of property damage or slope failures, nuisance water discharges onto a neighbor's property, stormwater pollution prevention. And then if we do have floodways that are coming off of our hillside properties, we do want to make sure that we are practicing good floodplain management. Next slide, please. So we have some minor edits. We were looking over our reports today, and it dawned on us that we had the incorrect date of the prior meeting. The prior meeting that we had before Ordinance Committee was July 21st, 2020. And we want to make sure that the staff report is accurate. And so there's two places in the staff report where that date, we said August 18th, and it was July 21st. And then we were looking at the current ordinance, unamended, and we noticed that item J 103.2, section J 103.2, item 7B, had a discrepancy in determining the number of cubic yards of grading that was exempt from permit. So we recommend that if this item is going to be moved to City Council, that the motion that's made specifically address this and ask for section J 103.2, item 7B to be modified as shown in the slide so that it is less than 50 cubic yards. It currently says more than 50 cubic yards, and then in another section it says less than 50 cubic yards, and we want it to be consistent throughout so the community can understand exactly where the threshold is and that it's at 50 cubic yards. Next slide, please. So the program that we're proposing is a self-certification program for hillside parcels. And it's for those hillside parcels where someone wants to, within a 5-year period or less, move with more than 10 and less than 50 cubic yards of grading, amounts that would normally be exempt from a grading permit. And they would need to fill out the self-certification of grading form and sign it and attest to the accuracy of it and deliver that to our office so that it can become a public record. Next slide, please. The form, when we create it, will have some standard information on it, parcel owner information, dates of the anticipated minor grading activity that's going to occur, and a description of that grading, including how much grading is going to occur and in what areas of the property or parcel. And those amounts should be broken out in cut and fill or excavation and fill of grading so that it's very clear how much earth is being removed, how much earth is being brought in, or how much earth is being cut and moved to another location as fill. And they need to sign that statement of liability. That way we can enforce if necessary, and we know that the people who are filling out these forms are taking the form seriously and giving us accurate information. Next slide, please. Part of that form is going to include an acknowledgement of the conditions of approval. So they're going to have to say that they are complying with our grading regulations. And that they're making a declaration of the total quantities and locations and that it's accurate. And that they understand that we could, if we have a question about the quantities or locations, we could require them at their expense to obtain a topographical survey and submit it to us to verify the work that they've done. Next slide, please. We envision that the self-certification form will be signed and delivered to our office. We'll have an electronic means for receiving that through email, as well as they can mail it through the US mail. Next slide, please. And once we receive those and we've entered those into our street file public record system, they will be available for people to view 24/7 on the web, or they can make an appointment here at our office to view the documents. Next slide, please. We also added a violation and penalties section, J114, for violations. And it's very clear and helps us as enforcement staff to be able to follow through and identify violations and then and seek either remedies and penalties if necessary. This is very, very explicit in the amended ordinance. Next slide, please. So the ordinance, we're recommending to the ordinance committee that they direct us to send the amended grading ordinance with the minor edits that were made to section J103.2 item 7 that we discussed, I shared earlier in the presentation, to send those to City Council for an introduction and a public hearing and for consideration of adoption. And with that, I'm be more than happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Stuffler. I'll now open it up to my colleagues. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hey, Mr. Stuffler, hope you're doing good. So I kind of get the kind of big picture of this, but I'm really confused over where in the timeline of a project the either ability to ask for a more than a self-certification or the complaint of a neighbor takes place relative to when the work is being done and not completed and moved on to say pouring foundations or whatever work is going on. So could you walk me through how that's supposed to happen?
Yes, no problem. So, and there are going to be, I'll point out a part of this that is going to be rough, right? So we talk about grading of more than 10 cubic yards, less than 50 cubic yards requires the self-certification in the Hillside area. And that's 10, more than 10 and less than 50 cubic yards in any 5-year period. That 5-year period has to start when we adopt the ordinance, because we're not going to have a record of what was done in the 5 years prior, or the 4 years prior, right? 4 months or 4 years, 11 months prior. So that's kind of the rub. That's a part of the ordinance that we'll live with until we've had the ordinance for 5 years. Once we've had the ordinance for 5 years, if we receive any complaints or we observe grading on a parcel, we should be able to go back to that parcel street file and see self-certification of grading for any quantities that were moved that were greater than 10 cubic yards and less than 50. If we do go back or we go out on site and we see more than 50 cubic yards has been moved in a 5-year period, then we will ask for them to provide a survey, and we will compare that survey data to our city survey data that we have. We have flown over the city. We've hired a service to fly over the city twice, I believe. Last time was in 2015, if I remember correctly. They do a LiDAR. It's a light reflective topography. It's very accurate when there's no vegetation, but in areas where there's vegetation, it's not quite as accurate. But we'll use that to compare it to the survey that's provided to us to see what the quantities were, how the topography's changed in that 5-year period.
So I think my concern is a little more specific than that answer. So let's just say I'm only worried about current projects, whether that's new construction or redevelopment in the form of additions or even in the case of, say, an ADU, where it's a ministerial approval of an ADU. And so I'm ready to go. I'm ready to get my excavator out, and I self-certify. And right then, the next week, I'm going with my excavator, and one of two things happens. Either you guys don't like what you're being told on the self-certification, or a member of the public says what's taking place out there is certainly not what's on that survey. So what takes place at that time to stop the project and catch it so it doesn't become a project that is completed or more completed, not completed, but more completed, and take us into further difficulty in trying to go backwards? But
Okay.
how does that mechanics work in a timeline of a project? That's what I'm interested in, real time, so that the complaint isn't being raised when we're framing, that kind of thing.
Right. So when we receive a complaint, or if the inspector observes something during the foundation inspection or excavation, we would pause during that day that we found it and talk to the permit holder and property owner and ask them, let's take a look at your approved plans for your ADU or whatever the project might be. Let's look at the quantities of grading that you've called out on those approved plans, and let's look to see if you have any self-certification grading forms that have been filled out in the prior 5 years. And we would tally those up and do an assessment on site to see that the work on site matches the approved plans and any self-certification forms that had been filled out. At that point, we make a decision. It is either in compliance with the approved plans and forms, or it is not. And if it is not, then we have to make a decision on how do we further verify it. Do we require a survey? Do we require just a letter from the project civil engineer? And that might depend on the extent of grading difference that we see. If it's vastly greater grading on site than what they've been permitted for, we don't need to require the license survey necessarily. We can make that observation ourselves. And if it's closer to 50, 51, 52 cubic yards, then we may say that's beyond my ability to estimate. I'd like to have a licensed surveyor survey the property and provide a topographical survey.
Okay, and where in the proposed ordinance does it say that the project will stop at that time, at the start of your narrative there?
Stopping the project is at the discretion of the inspector in my office.
Okay.
So
but where is the ordinance-backed authority to do that? Is it in a different ordinance that governs chief building officer stuff and not necessarily in here?
So both, I believe it's in here, and it is in the building code for the structure that they're building. But
Okay.
there are requirements in here in the grading ordinance to allow us to stop the work if someone is doing work in violation or that is contrary to whatever approvals they've granted or exceptions they've taken.
Okay, I'll look for that. I'm sure you're going to get other questions. And then, so, but the ordinance obviously doesn't say there's an automatic stop while that's resolved. It's at your discretion or the building inspector's discretion, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And it is section J 103.4 unpermitted grading that prohibits that. And then we can cite that as a violation because they're not.
Yeah, okay, I understand that, but here's my question though. The phrase you just used, unauthorized, there's a determination process that has to be made there, and maybe even legal people have to get involved. And until that happens, that you can is there a potential of a period of time that goes by while you're working through that process to determine it's unauthorized and the work continues on site? Whereas the work doesn't have to stop at notice of you're going to come gather more information or ask for a survey or some type of engineer's statement. and the work has to stop at that time. You follow what I'm saying? We've
Yes.
we've had situations where I think the city's even done stop work orders, and the work has continued while we've done multiple stop work orders while we've been fighting along this. And eventually what happens is you have this body of work completed that you can't take back. You can't go back while this process was taking place. So one of my concerns is how to address the process itself, your process itself, so that when there either is a discrepancy seen internally or a neighborhood complaint, and there's going to be a determination, that the work is stopped at that time until the determination is made. And what's in the ordinance doesn't necessarily say it that way, right?
You are correct. This ordinance doesn't say it, but this ordinance is just one element of the state building code. It is an appendix chapter in the building code. The building code does specifically allow us to stop work. And that is what we do when we find violations that are contrary to the approved plans and we think will could result in a significant hazard to the community.
No, so I get that. The words I don't like there is when we find and how long it takes us to find. That's what I'm asking about specifically.
It
So-
usually takes us less, we stop the work for usually immediately we stop the work, and it takes us a day or two, working day or two, to look at the approved plans and to make the determination. It is a priority for us because someone is doing work and they've got a lot of.
So I'm still talking about the time period before you stop the work, when you're going to go do we find.
No, we stop it
process.
when we doubt.
You
And
do.
then-
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yes. I'm sorry, I didn't pick up on that.
No, that's what I'm really asking is there's a credible complaint that involves going out to figure out what's going on, but going out to figure what's going on takes a week, 2 weeks, and then you find something or you don't find something. But during that 2 weeks, that work continued rather than erring on the side of caution and stopping the work. Because you can go out and do a visual too. And is it stopping the work while you're still making the case for that something unauthorized has taken place on paper? Does that make
Yes.
sense?
Yes, and we have done that. We've done that on 2 Hillside properties within the last 4 years. We've
Okay.
stopped work, sat down, gone through the plans, determined whether or not the work could resume or not. In both instances, we required, no, in one instance, we required a survey. In the other instance, we did not.
Okay. And then that section J114 that you keep saying adds some teeth to this, it really doesn't say what the consequences of that section are. And so is there a reason for that? Because the consequences are somewhere else, or? So it doesn't say I can take civil action. It doesn't say what the fine is. It doesn't say I can stop your project indefinitely until you comply with the city. It just kind of says, well, it just kind of says what it says. It just kind of says you can't do this, and the city can take steps, but it doesn't say what those steps are that were actually listed in your staff report. So why not?
Okay, I'm going to defer to John Doimus from our city attorney's office for the legal
Sure.
part of that, but I can tell you that the citation part of it, which is a civil citation that we issue, is in Chapter 1 of the Santa Barbara Municipal Code, and that is a remedy that we can, or a penalty that we can apply without the city attorney's office. And we can apply that immediately if necessary.
So my question, Mr. Doimus, before you tell me why I'm really just barking up the wrong tree, is why isn't that referenced civil code, or why isn't that civil code referenced in this paragraph in this ordinance?
Sure, Councilmember Jordan. It goes back to Title 1 of the Municipal Code, so Chapter 1.28. Any violation of the municipal code is, it can be charged as a misdemeanor, which is a penalty up to $1,000, or it can be assessed as a civil fine for the fine schedule that we have in place. So we don't have to specifically call out the penalties. They're already inherently in Chapter 1.28 and Title 1 of the Municipal Code. So those are the penalties and provisions we can take place, unless for some reason we would want to be greater. But that is that is what the municipal code allows us to do. So what we want to do here is define what the violation is.
So just the 3 words saying is a violation is a clear link back to the reference that you're talking about right there. It needs
Correct.
nothing more.
It needs nothing more.
Because that whole paragraph really does nothing except says is a violation, but it doesn't tell me what it's violating, doesn't point to what the violation really is. It doesn't point to the consequences of the violation. It's just inherent within the words is a violation.
It's inherent. We also have the option to bring back and cite to those sections of the Muni Code, which is 1.28. But any violation, if you look at the section under Title I, any violation of the municipal code can be prosecuted as a misdemeanor or through civil fines by the city attorney's office or through administrative fines through building and safety.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Then Mr. Stuffler, I think my last question is on this random 20% process. So your office is going to commit to, at least for a while, until we find out how bad that workload is. Just these self-certifications, you get a stack of them, you're going to pull out a random 20% and review them. You know, in my words would be see what they smell like, see what they look like, see if something jumps up at you. And then what would be the role of a neighbor then in that context if a neighbor was watching truckload after truckload of soil being hauled away and they make a complaint? Is that separate to this 20% kind of audit that we would do? And then the same steps would be followed as you've laid them out for a neighbor's complaint too? You'd review the self-certification, you'd do a site survey or site inspection, and at that time decide whether to issue a stop work order and ask for more information, or that you would just say it looks pretty good and allow it to continue. Is that how you kind of see the process?
So the 20% was what I felt was a reasonable amount of confirmation to do, but we're totally open to changing that if council feels, the committee or council feels that there should be more or less confirmation. There is a workload issue associated with it, but we're willing to try that for a year, try that on and see if that's something we can absorb into our normal workload. Code enforcement matters, a complaint from a neighbor or anyone would be included in that 20%. That's part of that 20%. So I think that addresses the first part, but there's a question at the end.
So I'm a neighbor, and I think too many truckloads are leaving. Yeah. I look at the self-certification that was filed online, or I come down and look at it. I'm saying, there's no way. This is 100 cubic yards, 75 cubic yards. Something's out of sorts. Mm-hmm. And so, what's the path for a neighbor then? And then what process happens as a result of that?
The neighbors have 2 paths. Actually, have one path that forks. So they make a complaint to us. We've had neighbors take pictures of roll-offs, different roll-offs on different days. And then they can bring that to us and we can look at that, and we can, if we can see the roll-off and who the roll-off, hopefully it's Marburg, someone we can go to. We can check in with Marburg and ask them about the roll-offs. They track all the roll-offs that come from all the sites they serve, so they can tell us whether it was earth or rubble or combination. So we do that research on the reports from the neighbors. If we have reason to believe the neighbors showing us evidence that clearly, very likely more than 50 cubic yards has been moved, or more has been moved than they attested to in their form, we will require a professional surveyor or a licensed civil engineer to go out using the best data available and determine how much earth has been moved.
And so why would it be, other than this is the way we always do it, why would it be the burden on the neighbor to provide credible evidence rather than the city include as part of their response to a complaint the technology and the processes that you already alluded to? So I know that the roll-offs are, you've said those are troublesome before because they can combine rubble. They can combine soil from different sources, whether it's the pad or the foundation, and also out there where they're really carving down a mountain. But why would we not automatically respond to a neighbor's complaint by like using the LiDAR information we have?
The LiDAR information is very reliable when there is no vegetation. There is a lot of vegetation in the hillside areas here. So we have found when we've gone to use it that the level of accuracy diminishes. And so as a base for us to kind of make a decision, to look at a current topographical survey compared to the LiDAR in areas with vegetation, we don't get a lot of, we can't come to a conclusive decision sometimes, and that's problematic. This is grading. I mean, grading is largely a trust issue. Once that earth is moved, especially over time, it becomes more and more difficult to determine what earth was moved where. I'm open to any solutions that that the professionals around us can offer. I've had people suggest that we use drones and a drone service and require a drone to fly over the property and do a topographical survey, which is a reality now. That seems extreme to me as a enforcement professional, but if that's what the committee and city council would like, we will build a drone program into our grading ordinance or something similar to a program like that. But this is the struggle. How do we reasonably enforce, reasonably establish a grading ordinance without that is enforceable without having unreasonable requirements for those who do comply?
Welcome to our lives. Then last question. So a neighbor complains, you do what you can. There was lots of vegetation. You can't use LiDAR. The stuff from Marburg is a mess. The inspector's just kind of going, how are we supposed to tell? So we're not willing to go to the next step of having somebody come in and forensic the whole thing. The neighbor doesn't agree with that. What recourse does the neighbor have to pursue an appeal of that decision?
Thank you. Yeah, that was the fork in the road that I didn't explain. So if the neighbor doesn't like our decision that we've made on how to enforce on their complaint, they can file an appeal and be heard before the Building and Fire Code Board of Appeals. That's a city board, and that board will listen to testimony and render a decision with findings. And once the board has done that, then that neighbor, if they don't like that decision, can take that decision of the board and appeal it to Superior Court.
Which is just a fancy way of saying file a lawsuit, right? Yeah, okay. All right, I think it's more questions than I wanted to ask. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Steffler.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. Thank you, Mr. Steffler, for your work on this and seeing it through. I have a couple questions. Just from the outset, I think 50 cubic yards is a perfectly reasonable threshold, and I really am trying to avoid over-regulating this smaller amount. I mean, 50 cubic yards is just not that much. And if it's truly, that threshold is like truly being honored, you know, the good actors, this isn't a problem and they don't need to be over-regulated below the 50. And it's the bad actors that I'm concerned about. And I'm still not clear with this ordinance or these changes on what this does for that. So I have some questions about the 50 cubic yards in the first place. You said a couple of times, like if we go out and we see that more than 50 cubic yards is removed, how do you see that? Is that sort of like eyeballing it, or it's a calculation, or like that's the first off? What are you looking for when you go and look, and what does it look like that more than 50 cubic yards has been removed?
We will go back and look at the topographical data that we have for the parcel. That could be prior plans that were submitted, site plans. That could be the LiDAR that the city has. And then we'll go on site and we'll compare that to the topography on site. And it is an eyeball. We have to pick a point of reference. We'll usually find a building corner or a survey marker that gives us an elevation that we can work from. And then we have to estimate and use line of sight and people with tape measures, and you're measuring the elevation difference at key areas so that you can try to do the mathematics to figure out what's the volume of earth that has been either removed or filled or relocated. And it for the building inspector, it's very challenging. So when we're close to 50 or clearly, over a threshold of 40, then we start looking closer and we'll ask for a surveyor to go out. With the survey systems that are available to the public now, you can have a survey done by a drone through a professional survey company at a pretty affordable price, depending, assume as long as you don't have a lot of overhead trees and things like that you have to navigate. Otherwise, they have to come out and they use their rod and their level, or their rod and their digital instrumentation, and they work out a topography and they deliver it to us, and we compare it to what they had submitted to us before and to what we have in our LiDAR system, and we have to make a judgment as to how much earth has been moved. The closer they are to 50, the more difficult it is. It's our problem, and it's not just the city of Santa Barbara's, but the problem in the industry is we don't have good baseline data. If we lived in a community that didn't have any trees or had very few trees, we'd have a lot better baseline data, but it is very difficult to acquire baseline data that is accurate enough to see 6-inch differentials over half an acre.
And then when an applicant comes in with their baseline topographic map, I know there's been some instances where that map doesn't match the street file map that we have, or even our own LiDAR map or our city records. And sometimes it happens that it's way far along in the process that comes to light, that like, wait a minute, this doesn't even match what we have on file at the city. At what point, is that generally cross-checked, or is that just too much effort? Or do you just take whatever the base map is that the applicant comes with? How does that work?
So are we talking about the site inspections relative to the approved plans?
Once you go out and the grading is already done, and so that you have the current grading, and you're trying to, like you're saying, compare back to what the original topography was, and the topographic map that was submitted with the applicant is different than the topographic maps that the city has on file, or that the city has in their own data for what, say, the slope of that hillside was. And that doesn't usually come out until there's been a complaint or further along. What happens with that reconciling? How do you reconcile city records versus what was submitted with the permit when they don't match up? What happens then?
Right, so we stop the work, and that's when we pull all the resources that we have together, all the available information. We sit down and we look at it to try to make heads or tails out of what is going on the site and what was the prior topography. If we get to the point where we can't come to that conclusion, we require the property owner to have a licensed civil engineer or a surveyor tell us in their professional opinion and stamp and seal an opinion of theirs. And we rely on that opinion.
Thank you. And then when you're going out and sort of eyeballing what the 50 cubic yards is, you can't tell from that how much of that is rubble and how much of that is true grading. You can only get a bulk mass amount by looking at that, or is that part of the?
It's against the law to put rubble under your grading. Rubble is to be disposed of, and earth is supposed to be maintained as earth without rubble in it. It's not people aren't supposed to turn their properties into concrete rubble storage or concealment locations, right? That's against the grading regulations and the general regulations of the city. So it should be, the assumption is it's earth. It may be stones, larger, smaller, but it shouldn't be concrete, shouldn't be foundations, shouldn't be asphalt. It shouldn't be any rubble at all.
Okay, so then so if a neighbor suspects that it's more than 50, or really you're kind of saying more than 40 because it's in the zone of error. Like I've seen permits come through with 49.5, and I mean, you know, and then that gets disputed and it's like, well, no, the eyeball survey says 49.5, so done. And my question is then, if a neighbor feels there's an issue, so then they can take it to the appeals, building fire code appeals, and at that point they determine whether there's enough to question if it was the 50 cubic yards or not? Or
When an item goes before the Board of Appeals, our office drafts a staff report and makes a recommendation to the board what our opinion is on it, what our finding was and why. The board can ask any questions they want. They can require whatever evidence they think is appropriate to render their decision, including they could ask for additional survey information or testimony from a surveyor or civil engineer. And then the board they make findings, and then they render their decision. The problem is the significant digits kind of part of it, right? Is that trying to determine 47 cubic yards of grading from 53 is it on a quarter acre or even an eighth of an acre is really hard to do. And that's where we rely on the integrity of the design professional that we ask to give us an opinion of how much earth has been moved.
okay, thank you. So then I just have just a couple questions here. I guess we'll wait till discussion to say, but so the building officer, the chief building officer, as it's written in the ordinance, I'm just going to run down a list here, and can you just verify? So building officer can determine whether it's a hazardous situation, or can say it's not a hazardous situation, or can determine if you need an environmental report, or can waive the need for an environmental report, or can determine if you need a topographic survey, or no, you don't need a topographic survey, or can determine conditions of approval, can stop a project, or can decide no, not to stop a project, can set the amount of a security, or say, no, you don't need to do a security. It could still issue permits even when there are legal questions going on. Is that all? Am I understanding that all correctly? And this isn't personal, this is the position of building officer, has that authority. Is that true?
That is the typical authority of a building official in any community in the state of California, yes.
And then
But we don't make those decisions. We as building officials, we don't make those decisions all on our own. We use the best available resources, including human resources around us, to help us completely understand as best as we possibly can what the situation is before we render a decision.
Thank you. And that comes, so that's not a single person's decision. That comes with a group decision and with oversight and with power of appeal also. I'm just trying to understand.
That's correct, but I am the oversight. The building official of the community is the oversight of the 10, 20 people who work in his or hers building division.
Okay. And then this ordinance would be adding additional authority to that for under 50 cubic yards, saying that in this case, then the building official could determine the need for topographic surveys, or it's basically like sort of a cut and paste of all of the authority under engineering grade, and now sort of applying it at the building official's authority to less than 50 cubic yards. Is that?
Yes, the way the codes are typically written, there are requirements that need to be met, and the building official has the authority to determine whether those requirements apply. The building code in the chapter 1, all the requirements in the building code, structural, disability, accessibility, energy, whatever it might be, exiting, fire resistant construction, it gives the building official the authority to waive the requirement to submit plans for a building permit.
Okay.
I can't waive the requirements. The project has to meet all the requirements, but I can waive the different materials. In a lot of instances, I can waive what's given to us in order to confirm compliance in the design. But in the field, when it's approved, I am responsible, and my staff represent me when they go out and issue an approval or a correction or stop work on a property.
And then if somebody has a question of that finding, then their recourse is to go to the Fire and Building Code Board, and then that's their appeal process. And then that decision's final within the city. Otherwise, it has to go to Superior Court. And is that?
Yes, so the only way they can get to Superior Court is to go through the Board of Appeals. Most of the time, my staff make a decision and someone doesn't like the decision, they go to that, they use the hierarchy of our division, and they go to the supervisor and say, hey, I don't like the decision that your inspector made. Supervisor reviews it, gives them an answer. If they don't like that, they bring it to me. If they don't like my decision, then we tell them this is the decision that's appealable to the Board of Appeals.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Proton Sneddon. Mr. Jordan?
Just have one more, if I might. So Mr. Steffler, I'm jumping around trying to make sure the details on your answers. So the appeal process is also not mentioned in this particular ordinance, this attachment. Is that part of the normal appeal process that's part of all the Title 22 actions? Is that where that's actually is hidden?
It's in Chapter 1 of the Building Code, and this is an appendix to the Building Code, so it is subject to the appeal.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Thank you, Mr. Stuffler. Madam Clerk, can you let me know how many callers we have or how many public comment?
Chair Gutierrez, we have two. Alan Gallegos and Fred Sweeney.
Okay. Let me just ask a couple of questions. So, Mr. Stuffler, just to reiterate, I know that in the first meeting you most likely went over these, but just want to get some clarifications. How often do you believe the grading violations are happening here?
Oh, I'm not prepared to answer that. I don't have any data that I could turn to make a finding for an estimate.
Okay. Do you happen to know or have a guess on how much property damage and slope failures we have had in the past, let's say 5 years or so?
No, but if you would like us to, we could do that research to find out what we're aware of as far as slope damage. There are private lawsuits that could happen that we wouldn't be aware of. I do know, I can think of two properties where there was damage at the adjacent property below. And that was within the last 2 or 3 years. There may have been more, but there are two that definitely got to my level and that I looked at.
And I suppose this is all to prevent some sort of natural disaster, right? Not necessarily a man-made disaster, but with the constant grading of a slope, it could make it easier for some sort of a debris flow or landslide. And that's where all of this is coming from, is just a safety standpoint.
Actually, it's more for, well, I shouldn't say more for, it's both. The majority of the time, though, we as human beings are modifying the earth, terrain, and composition, and we want to make sure that when we do that, we aren't creating a liability for others or ourselves. The standards for grading, in particular, they do acknowledge geology, but something like a Montecito debris flow, the grading ordinance would have no impact on that. So natural disasters, we try to mitigate up to a certain level, but we realize there are certain magnitude earthquakes, certain magnitude debris flows. We are not going to be able to mitigate the damage.
Okay. And how many other communities have an ordinance similar to this, or?
With the self-certification,
Mhm.
I'm not aware of any.
Okay. And so therefore, it'd be kind of hard to tell whether having ordinances like this protect property or life, so to speak.
That's correct. This is a program that I am not aware of existing in the state of California.
Okay. All right. Those are all my questions. Thank you, Mr. Stuffler. Madam Clerk, I believe we're ready to take public comment.
Great. I'm going to switch screens from Clerk Gorman so we can run the timer. So just give me one moment.
Okay.
Chair Gutierrez?
Yes.
Can
Madam
Oh.
President.
Thank you. I have another question. It can be either before or after public comment, whenever you think.
If we could do it now before Ms. Clerk takes a first public comment. Yes, Mr. Stuffler.
Thank you. So my question is, what was the general outcome of the public outreach? So you reached out to stakeholders, you kept it open. It was open the last time we met, and then it stayed open. And what was the general, was there a general consensus or direction?
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, we did not further advertise the SurveyMonkey input. Given the direction that we received from the Ordinance Committee in July, we didn't feel that was necessary. So our outreach was simply to let the stakeholders know that we were going to have a hearing today before the Ordinance Committee, and then what the prospective timeframes might be for City Council if we move forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stuffler. Okay, Madam Clerk, we're ready to take first public comment.
Okay, our first speaker is Alan Gallegos. Alan Gallegos, please go ahead.
Hi, guys. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. As you are all aware, we have a case on 2919 and 2924 Reba Way where illegal grading has occurred. And those projects have been for 2 years now on stop work orders. And there's an existing criminal case as well. The city has grappled with revocation, yet revocation is what should occur to illegal abuses of the building codes. That is why I'm surprised we're talking so much about like how to determine grading amounts, how do the neighbors determine it? And I kind of wonder, does it matter? You know, Mr. Stuffler says that grading is mostly a trust issue. I would think that trust would be much more solid if you can hang permit revocation over the head of the applicant if they get it wrong. This way, going into a permit, they know clearly that they need to be accurate or risk starting over. I am not sure this grading ordinance as it stands will change anything except for making it more costly for the city and more costly for law-abiding homeowners and builders, especially since the building department is struggling in helping the community on cases like the one on Reba Way, where it is so clear-cut that the abuses taken by the applicant warrant the existing revocation process. Thanks, guys.
Okay, our next speaker is Fred Sweeney. Fred Sweeney, please go ahead.
So I can turn on my speaker. Thank you, Chair Gutierrez, and Council. I want to cover a few things. As a member of the Single Family Design Board, I'd like to thank Mr. Stuffler. He's going to arrange to come and talk to our board after this ordinance has been adopted to explain some of the issues we face. But I wanted to bring up a couple of things. One is, it might be helpful for people to understand, Mr. Stuffler, that when a permit is issued, there are instructions about when the contractor has to call for inspections. And I believe, I'm trying to remember whether or not they're called for when the excavations are completed for inspection, and also when the formwork has been lifted. So that's one question. The other question I have is, we are seeing a lot of projects, even on the hillsides, where people want to put in full basements. That's a lot of soil that has to be pulled out, or very large swimming pools. The board generally tries to encourage them to try to lose that soil on the site. And it's only because in a lot of times reference to the audience, the neighbors who are in attendance, because as you know, the SFDB is generally one of the only public meetings neighbors have an opportunity to talk about a project. And up in the hillsides, they're very concerned about construction traffic, which our board has no purview over, unlike the Planning Commission. So we're not allowed to put conditions on the project in terms of truck traffic, et cetera. So in trying to find ways to diminish the amount of truckloads leaving a site, we want to encourage. So the dirt that's under the swimming pool excavation and a full basement excavation as defined by this ordinance is not subject to this 50-yard requirement, but in some cases that can be a lot of soil that has to leave the site or is lost on the site, graded on the site. So maybe a little clarification there would be helpful, and certainly to Mr. Jordan's concerns about when the inspectors actually come out and look at things. Thank you.
Chair Gutierrez, we have no more public speakers.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Now I'd like to open the floor to my colleagues for discussion. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. I have to say, I feel very conflicted about this. I appreciate that it's an attempt to address the concerns, but I think it just ends up being very onerous on the people under 50 cubic yards without, for me, the desired outcome of there being more of an appeal process when neighbors are seeing what might be bad actors. And so I just don't see anything in this ordinance that helps with that determination at that 50 cubic yards. You know, some that have been, and I realize it's complicated, and I understand that, but I'm not seeing in this what in self-certification, it just seems like an extra burden, and 50 cubic yards is not that much if it truly is just grading material. My concern is that we do have situations apparently where many more roll-offs that may not be Marburg, may not be certifiable by somebody we can verify with. Other things are happening, and then there's, you know, pretty much sole authority to be able to say that it's happening or not happening, and there's not much beyond that. So I think this doesn't, I'm not sure where to go with this, because it seems onerous to me, and it doesn't address really that question of the people who know how to work the system, and they can, you know, take, I know that this happens regularly, that you can take material off and dump it somewhere else. Like, it doesn't need to go to Marburg to be weighed and accounted for in that way. So I'm not sure where to go with that. So I'm looking to you, Mr. Jordan, Councilmember Jordan, to see what your thoughts are.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon. Mr. Jordan.
Well, I'll certainly not clear that up any better. So I have the same kind of concerns. Mr. Gallegos's question kind of just weighs on me also, that it's similar to what Councilmember Sneddon says, that this is another step that kind of validates the good players without really having a consequence for the bad players. It's almost like I'd like to see much more emphasis on the consequences in this ordinance, with less emphasis on the 98 or 95% who are complying. And I don't really know how to remedy that either, which is, I always tell myself I'm never going to do this. Like, say I don't like something, but then be sitting here and not have the answer on what road to go down. But I don't like that chapter, the second to last chapter, that you have to go look somewhere else to find out what the consequences are, and then you have to go look somewhere else to find out what your appeal things are. That in fact was the spawn of the new zoning ordinance at one time, so you didn't have to go look in multiple places. To me, the purpose of this ordinance is still, to make the legal team cringe. The purpose of this ordinance is to stop the examples we're seeing on Ariba Way as the poster child of what's taking place. And I don't know that this ordinance does that. It's still open-ended and heavily slanted in favor of the burden on catching somebody, the burden on the person who complains to be credible, when that, to me, that's the city's role to do all that work or be in a position to have done that. But the just signing and filling out a piece of paper with nobody doing anything to compare that to what's on site before the excavation starts. I don't know. I don't have a good resolution on the path I want to pursue, but I also the kind of the outline of the ordinance is not making me feel any better. So that's 2 out of 3 of us, Mr. Chair. Now I'll let you figure out how you can help both of us. So.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. I too have some reservations about the way the ordinance is being presented as is. If we're having a hard time trying to make, lack of a better way of saying it, make sense of it, then how are our residents going to do it? Especially when it's going to be their time, their money, their property on the line. I have the urge to pass this to council in the hopes that we can better make sense of it. But I also feel like maybe we should send it back before doing that. But that's just my current thought, because yeah, this is something that that in theory could be explained and defended as being something that's protecting property and life. But I hear what you all are saying about how, it doesn't seem to have the consequences clearly stated. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. I had a question about, and this has come up before and it's coming up again today, is why don't we revoke a permit when there's been gross negligence? And I won't name particular properties because I don't know, and we're not in the authority to say, but if there's question of that, and if, say, there are legal proceedings happening or something like that, then, and it is again that sole authority of the chief building officer to determine whether or not to revoke a permit. And as far as I understand, we don't ever revoke permits. And I'm questioning that. And I think that might be more of a deterrent than some of these other issues. I mean, I guess I have a question about that. And Councilmember Jordan also sort of mentioned that. And, if that's policy or not policy, maybe that is what council might want to discuss, is about what does it take to revoke a permit? And I realize, I guess a thought here too is that the chief building officer, none of these decisions should be political, which includes us, includes whoever that chief building official is. And so how do we get around that, I guess?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon. City Attorney Cologne, you came up
I
first.
just wanted to thank you, Chair Gutierrez. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, permit revocation needs to be understood in the context of taking away property rights. So the full range of due process requirements applies. And we've had litigation experience where improper permit revocations have led to fairly significant liability for the city. So the problem is that a neighbor may believe everything is unlawful and accomplished through lies and trickery. The city bears the burden of proving that. And if we guess wrong and delay a project for months and months and months, we have in the past been exposed to what are called temporary taking damages, which means the loss of use during that period. So revocation, because of those due process requirements, is something where we've had the need, and I've actually had these discussions with some of the representatives from Ariba Way. We've had the need to try and protect the process as a matter of constitutional due process rights from allegations that we can't prove. So that's the long answer.
Thank you, Mr. Cologne. Mr. Stuffler?
No, I was just here in support of Ariel in case he had a question or one of you had a question for me. But we're following the practices of building officials for the city. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Stuffler. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon?
But I guess my follow-up to that, I'm just looking again here at what the topic on the screen here is, addressing grading less than 50 cubic yards. I guess my direction and my issue with this is I don't think we need to be addressing grading that's less than 50 cubic yards. I think the issue is whether someone is fudging about whether it's the 50 cubic yards that's actually been removed or not. And that's what I'm not really seeing that this fixes. And I guess that's what I'm looking for is a real impartial way that can be appealed, that's, that in those egregious cases, I don't think we need to be addressing less than 50 cubic yards. I'm just not seeing that as our danger zone. I'm seeing that if it truly is above the 50 and it should be kicked to SFDB, but instead it's not, and you're in that zone, that's what my concern is. And especially if we start back up with ADUs and the hillsides, and those ministerial approval, and then the temptation to just do the grading and, fix it later because it's already done, the concrete's poured, Mr. Jordan, what does this, that's my concern is that issue. So I don't really want to hassle people for under 50 cubic yards. I want an accurate depiction of how we determine if someone has egregiously gone over that threshold.
Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor Pro Tem Senator, just address the one question that's kind of been at the forefront of this. The purpose of the self-certification under that 50 is it gives another enforcement tool, right? By requiring a property to attest that they truly, with their engineer, whoever they hire as this project, to truly attest that is under, that if we find evidence that is not, it adds further that it's intentional. So that was the purpose behind that, just to help further discussion along. So that's what the purpose of that was for.
Thank you. And then one last question on that. So if you're going to do grading that's under 50 cubic yards and it wouldn't ordinarily require a permit, you now need to self-certify. You need, like I can't move some dirt around on my property if before I knew that I wouldn't have to get a permit for it, but now I'm worried about self-certifying.
That's correct if you're going to move more than 10 cubic yards.
Yeah, I think that's the threshold. Super not comfortable with that burden.
You can please give us direction, and we want to bring back to you what we think you're looking for, and that's what we were trying to work with in this draft. We're more than happy to come back with another draft if that's what you desire. It could be on a whole different track if you'd like.
I truly appreciate that. And I do appreciate that this is responsive to an issue that I've been bringing and having and kind of hammering on. And so I apologize that it's neither here nor there, but my issue is that threshold when it's how to determine when it's gone over that. So I guess that's my, yeah. I'll leave it at that. I'm happy either way. If we don't move forward with this ordinance, that's actually okay with me because I don't think it actually addresses that particular issue.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Colon, if I could have you come back on that, when you're talking about that, the revocation consequences. So I guess what I'm uneasy about is I don't see anything in this that provides real teeth against somebody who's abusing the thresholds up until revocation. Whereas I think probably the building official or Mr. Demoy is saying that, oh no, we're adding teeth. But I guess my feeling is that we're in the situation we are in certain places because we already had some steps we could have taken or we did take, but they didn't work too well. But we have this this threat laying over us. If we go all the way to revocation, we potentially put the city in liability. So what is there up to revocation that could be strengthened in this draft ordinance?
Chair Gutierrez, Councilmember Jordan, that's what we're trying to do with the self-certification. What we're looking for from an enforcement standpoint are easy to prove facts. Signing a piece of paper that's under penalty of perjury and has false information is an easy fact to prove. The other feature here is that by setting a percentage of applications we would take a look at, we allow the council to manage the level of enforcement through funding. One year you might decide you want to look at 50% of the applications in the hillsides. And over time, we might find that we can look at fewer. So I viewed the self-certification as a relatively simple way to force contractors and owners to give some thought to what they were doing when they signed a piece of paper that went to the city. And in addition, then giving us simply provable facts to revoke or to prosecute.
And then, so in your opinion, that scenario you just paint out in terms of having that self-certification would be, in essence, a game changer over the situation we were in before without it? I mean, is that really what we're saying?
The game changer, in my mind, there are several game changers. The big one is that we would now be examining 20% of the self-declared less than 50 cubic foot exemptions. So we would, this ordinance puts us in an active monitoring position for 20% of the applications. It's another way to think of it.
And then also provides a tool for more tools for us when outside of that 20%, a adjacent neighbor has a complaint, rather than just it's the adjacent neighbor's anecdotal view of what took place, that we actually have a starting point because we also have another piece of paper and those 80% of them on file, right?
Yes, with this clarification, it is when the adjacent neighbor has a complaint and I have evidence amounting to probable cause of a violation of law.
But you're steps ahead of where we were before because you have the self-certification.
Absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Chair, so I don't know that I'm happy with this. I don't know that I'm unhappy with that, but I'm really happy with Mr. Colon's narrative right there, which through no fault of anybody, maybe me, that should have been the exact questions I should have asked for my first question. But I would say with that narrative from Mr. Colon, I'd be happy to, at the least, just send this, punt this up to council for a discussion among all 7 of us. And I'll do my best to remember the components that Mr. Colon just said in the way he said it as being part of the sales method. So I see some nods, so there can be more discussion, but I'll go ahead and just recommend that we move it to council as it is then.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Fine, thank you. Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. What if we made that threshold higher so that the self-certification starts at 40 cubic yards? Because then we're in the zone where it really, we may be closer to that 50 cubic yard threshold. I think the 10 might be a little low. And then we need to remember in the motion to update that J103.4 oh no, that's not the right one. For the above 50 cubic, under 50 cubic yard, we have to update that in the motion. But I think that's a good idea to move it forward. I support that. And I think with the change of, what are your thoughts on that? Of a change of having it not be 10 cubic yards, but that can be in the realm of just minor landscaping that you're doing that isn't really, grading that you need to self-certify and do all that, but maybe at 40 or 45.
So kind of your thought is kind of the ones that were already on the brink, the guy's not weaseling, and the one that would have been doing 15 or 20, that guy would have to be so obscenely making the effort to hide what he's doing that there would be other triggers, probably, neighbors or whatever. I'd be in agreement. So why don't I just pull my motion back off and we'll start over. And you had all the points, so why don't you go and then I'll second for you.
Okay. We could do it either way. It's fine.
No, you go ahead, because I'm struggling in my handout to find that section if you already have your finger on it.
Move this forward to council with the change in J103.2, item 7B, to be modified to less than 50 cubic yards, and a change to the self-certification threshold to 40 cubic yards and above.
I'll second that. And I see Mr. Stuffler lurking about.
Mr. Chair, is it appropriate? I just wanted to advise council or the committee on this decision. So the amendment that was recommended at the beginning, the edit that we talked about it, was it J103.2, item 7B. That is the exception for a grading permit. That has nothing to do with the self-certification. So if you change that to 40, it will be out of sync with the excavation exception, which is at 50. So I would recommend that you not do that, but and instead I would recommend you change section J103.3 to read a person proposing to conduct more than 40 cubic yards and less than 50. That's just my suggestion, and I'll kind of butt out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stuffler. Yeah, my only comment on the 40 cubic yards is that I imagine that if it's set at 10 cubic yards, that's enough earth that could be distributed around the property. But once you go higher than 10 cubic yards, that's what triggers, possibly using more equipment, bigger equipment, having to extract all that soil somewhere else, which would be an indicator that they could be doing something that would be going against this proposed ordinance. So I like what Mr. Stuffler recommended. If you would be willing to adjust your motion.
So adjusting it, thank you, Chair Gutierrez. So adjusting it to back to 10 or up to 40? I think up to 40 was Mr. Stuffler's suggestion.
Oh, is that what he said? Mr. Stuffler, can you just clarify?
Yes, thank you. It's the place in the ordinance where you make that adjustment. So if we make that adjustment in J103.3, that's the self-certification section. And it sounds like you don't want you desire self-certifications to occur when the grading exceeds 40 cubic yards. So changing that first sentence, of section J103.3, a person proposing to conduct more than 40 cubic yards of grading and less than 50, that would be the place to make that change. And then the other edit is just the edit to clean up the original ordinance in section J103.2, where we need to say under 7B is less than 50 cubic yards. And that's a kind of a different train of thought, but that has to do with the actual permit.
Thank you, Mr. Stuffler. Okay.
That's fine.
That could be in the updated motion if that's suitable.
I'll second that.
Okay. All right. Now that we have a motion and it's been seconded by, the motion was made by Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, seconded by Councilmember Jordan. I believe, Madam Clerk, that we're ready for a vote. I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Councilmember Jordan,
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon,
Yes.
Chair Gutierrez.
Aye. Okay, the motion passes unanimously. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for participating in this ordinance committee meeting. And we'll see you at 2 o'clock for the regular council meeting. All right, thank you very much.